Hey everybody, we're back with another Substance Painter tutorial because a lot of you asked for it. In the last video, we did a basic intro to Substance Painter for anyone who's never opened the program before. And this time we're going to go a little bit deeper and show some next steps or some finishing touches you can apply to the model that we worked on last time. And in that last video, I used this robot model, which is actually free on ProductionCrate. So if you have a free account, go ahead and grab it so you can follow along. And if you're new to Substance Painter, go ahead and go back and watch that first video we made because I cover all the controls and all the basics of the program. All right, here we go. Okay, for the first tip, we're actually going to continue on with the same robot from that previous video. And this first tip is going to seem very obvious once you hear it, but it's really easy to forget. I forget it all the time. But the tip is to just add one more layer of weathering or dirt or something like that over top of all of your materials. And what that's going to do is help it all blend together. As you're constructing the different materials on the model, like the chrome, the black rubber, and the white plates, you probably added some dirt and dust, but those might not exactly be the same color. So it might be appropriate to add one last dirt layer that goes over top of everything, or maybe a mud layer or something like that. So kind of an extreme example, I can drop this rust on top of the entire torso. And just like in that previous video, I'm going to change the color so it looks more like dust. Let's also increase the tiling. I'm going to add a black mask, just like we did before. And then I'll find an interesting smart mask that looks dusty or dirty, like maybe this one. So this is obviously a very extreme example. I may not want it to be this dirty, but you can see that by putting the same dirt on top of everything, all three materials at the very end, it ties them all together and makes them look like they belong together. Obviously, it's up to you to tone it down to make it look appropriate for the project you're making. And maybe you don't want to do dirt. Maybe that wouldn't be appropriate. Maybe water, mud, scratches, sun damage, anything like that, to make it feel like one cohesive, finished project. So for this next tip, we're going to introduce some color variation to make our textures look a little bit more interesting. This is one of the skeleton warriors that's up on RenderCrate, and you can see he's obviously got the blue robe option on right now. Right now it looks a little bit flat, a little bit boring, but check out what happens when I turn these layers on. So here's before and here's after. Before and after. If we look at just the color map, we can see what's happening. The first thing that I've added is this gradient at the bottom so that it kind of looks dark and maybe a little bit more brown at the bottom. I imagine it drags in the dirt. And then on the top half of the model, I added sun damage, so it's kind of faded at the top. Also, the higher, sharper wrinkles are a little bit faded. And then I experimented with adding a lot of darkness to the deep folds. So this is just one example of what I mean when I talk about introducing some color variation to break up big, broad areas of color. You can see even on this parchment, I introduced a slight gradient so it gets darker at the bottom. Let me show you how I did it. I'm going to turn off these layers and I'm going to kind of reconstruct a few of these effects. So right here is my blue fabric layer. I'm going to add a new layer just by clicking the paint bucket, and that's going to introduce a blank white sort of shiny material. I only want to affect the color, so I'm going to turn off all the channels except for color. And I'll name this dirt gradient. I'm going to make it something really dark for now. We can always adjust this later. Just go with the dark brown. Now I'm going to add a generator to this, and under this generator's button, I'm going to switch to mask editor. This is kind of the basic universal generator. You can use it to create any sort of pattern you want. If I alt-click, I can see right now it's just picking up the edges, but I want it to be a gradient from bottom to top. So if I click on the mask editor, I can scroll down in the options and I can see right now only curvature is activated, so I'll turn that off. And I want to turn on position gradient. And you can see what's happening is it's fading in from the top, which is the opposite of what we want, but it's closer. I'm going to press M for material. You can see it's fading in the brown color at the top of the robe. So let's go into the position gradient options, and you can see here some sliders for left to right, top to bottom, and front to back. Right now, it's going from top to bottom. We can further open up these options and go deeper in, and I can invert this. So now the gradient is going from bottom to top. If you scroll back up to the position gradient options, we have balance and contrast. This is going to help us control and constrain where the effect is falling on the model. So balance will slide the gradient up and down the model like this. And then if we want to tighten it up so it's a sharper transition, we can increase the contrast. And if we increase it all the way, you can see we end up with a sharp line, so I don't want that. If I press M for material, we can see the effect. We have a pretty cool looking dirt gradient now. Anything else you want to do is just artistic license. You can change the blending mode if you want it to be multiplied onto the model. It's up to you. So once I've created all my materials and sort of laid them out on the model, I usually go around and I find big broad areas of one big solid color and I break it up with gradients or things like that. But now that you understand the concept of adding color variation to big broad areas, you'll be able to push your project sort of over the top of what the general public is typically doing with their texturing projects. Okay, here's my next tip. This model is one of the wizard staffs that's up on ProductionCrate right now. This is the Druid variant. And you can see I've applied all of my materials that I want, and I've actually added all the gradients like I talked about with the robe on that skeleton guy. So here's my leather wraps, and it's got some color variations. It's got some lighter edges, and it's got some darker splotches. It can also be really helpful to think about how things are constructed in real life. So how are these leather strips made, and then how are they affixed to the model? So obviously they're kind of bluish, greenish, so they've been dyed or stained. Leather doesn't normally look like it's this color. So I imagine they made a sheet of it, and then they cut out strips. And when you cut something, you can see the inside of it along the edge. Like when you slice bread, you can see a different color on the inside. So what I like to do when I have this raw hide sort of look is I like to create a raw leather look along the edges of the model. So over here in my layers, I'm inside of my leather smart material. I'm going to go to the top, and I'm going to search for leather rough. I like to use this one for the edge of raw leather, and I'll drag this into my layer stack above everything else. Let's add a black mask, and I'm going to add a generator like before, but this time instead of using the mask editor, I'm going to use one called UV border distance. So at first it kind of looks the way it looked before, but that's because the effect is a little bit too overpowering. Let's turn down the balance, and you'll see that the raw hide effect is kind of shrinking away towards the UV seams. And you can see the effect I'm going for. Now we will have to manually paint these vertical stripes away, but we're getting closer to what we want. I'm going to increase the contrast and adjust the distance and the balance slider so that it looks like the raw hide is just on the edges of the leather. Okay, let's clean up these vertical edges, which we don't want. I'm going to go up to my effects and add a paint effect right here, and then I'll press X to invert and get a black brush, and I can just paint this away. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's going to look like rough leather anyway. Okay, and where you take it from this point is really dependent on the look you're going for or the material that you're trying to replicate. But if we continue on with this example, I think that I want to roughen it up a little bit. It's a little bit too straight and perfect. So I'm going to add a filter, and in the filters, I'm going to go all the way to the bottom and use warp. So what warp does is it kind of makes things wiggly, but it's a little bit too much. Let's turn down the intensity. And I think those wiggles or those bumps are too big. So I'm going to open up the source parameters, and let's increase the tiling. So it's basically just a noise pattern. Let's lower the intensity just a little bit. Okay, and once again, it really depends on the material that you're trying to replicate, but for this leather, I think I'm going to push the height of this lighter color in a little bit. So if I click on the material itself, I can scroll way down to the technical parameters and decrease the height position just slightly, and it will push in that tan rawhide material. And just another quick example of this, if you look here on the wood, you can see there's this little knot where this branch was cut off from this staff, and so I actually chose a lighter color wood to make it look like those lighter fibers that are inside of the branch. So think of that whenever you're doing texturing. How are things constructed? And not just the thing itself, but the materials that are used for the object. So if you're texturing a gun, for example, look at reference for how the barrel is machined and the directionality of the grinding that shaped that barrel. Okay, for the next tip, we're actually going to continue on with this same project, and it's kind of similar to that previous tip. So we talked about how the leather strips themselves were constructed, and now we're going to talk about how the staff was constructed and how the leather was affixed to the staff. Right now, what we see is one long, sort of endless strip of leather, and there's no place where it starts and stops. It doesn't really make sense. So I'm going to introduce some stitching that shows where the leather strips start and stop and how they're connected to each other. And doing this can really sell the realism of your texture. There's a pretty good built-in brush for this in Substance Painter. If you go to your Brushes tab and search for Stitching or Stitches, there's a few different options here. I'm going to do this one because it seems kind of the most primitive and basic. So I'll click on this brush, and then I'll add a new blank layer, a paint layer. And I'll do a quick test just to see what it looks like. And you can see what's happening is it creates the look of stitching there, but it's not just the color, it's actually the height. You can see that there's a little bit of normal interaction, like lighting interaction. Let's undo, and let's set up this brush a little bit better. If I scroll down to the parameters, I can actually change the color of the stitches themselves. Let's do kind of a tan. I want like a raw twine look. Test that out. Might be a little bit too bright. Okay, getting closer. We can adjust some other things like the puncture intensity, and now we get a little bit more of that height interaction. With this particular brush, we can actually choose the stitch pattern and the type of thread. So if you want to try cross diagonal, get a slightly different look. If we want to do thin thread, we get a thinner stitch. That actually looks pretty good. I think I'll go with that one. but there's tons of patterns here. That actually looks pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is just draw a few stitches here so it looks like this leather is stitched together. Alright, the size and the placement is totally up to you, but hopefully you get the idea. Try to think about how stuff is put together. Here's just another really quick example of what I'm talking about. So I've got this armor plate here with an obviously different piece of metal affixed to it. Well, how does that piece of metal attached? It's not glued. I don't think they had glue like that in the Middle Ages. I don't think it's welded, so it's probably riveted, right? So we need to see those rivets. And Substance Painter actually already has a cool brush for that called Nails, and it's very similar to the stitches. You can see it adds a little nail there, but it also changes the way the surface curves, so it looks like it's actually dented inward. And that's all changeable here inside of the brush. So there's surface dent, you can increase the slope of the head of the nail, you can increase the rustiness of it, and you can get a really interesting and sort of extreme effect where it looks like it's really denting that brass material. Another example of how things can be affixed together is weld lines. When I modeled this thing, this spike was a separate object. It is a separate object. Same thing with the skull. It's not part of the knee pad. But I don't want them to look like they're just pushed through each other because that just gives away that it's a 3D object and not something real. So I tried to consider how is this constructed in real life. I figured maybe they welded it together, so I added these little weld lines with a brush. And that leads into our next tip, which is, again, related to the previous one, but it's prop interaction or height interactions. A lot of this is done in the modeling phase. So for example, if you have a character that's wearing some sort of cloth garment with straps over it, you want to model in folds so it looks like the straps are pressing in on the cloth, like on this wizard character with these scrolls around his waist. But sometimes the separate objects that you've modeled are so small that you can't model in how they're pressing into the other object. It's just too small of a detail to model, and so I like to do that here in Substance Painter in the texturing phase. So for example, these knee spikes are hammered into the metal, so I'm going to add a separate layer just for height interactions where they're touching. It's very similar to what I showed you earlier with the rivets, but those were pure textures. This is actually where two physical separate objects are interacting. I want to think about how they're interacting and how they would press up against each other. The way I like to do this is add a new fill layer, and I'll name it Height Interactions. And this time I want to affect only the height, so I'm going to turn everything off except for the height channel. And here on the height slider, I'll turn it down very, very slightly, like minus 0.1, something like that. Now you really won't see anything change at this point, and that's because we've changed the height of the entire surface. So what we need to do is mask off this layer and then reveal it only where we want it. So if I click here and add a black mask and just do a really quick test by painting white somewhere, you'll see sort of the highlights and shadows change wherever you paint. If you want it to be more extreme, click back on your layer and lower the height even more, and you start to see what we did. We have this layer where it's sort of stepped down in height, and we're painting the mask to reveal where it's pushed in. So I'm gonna clear that by right-clicking and adding a black mask again. That'll clear it out. And what you can do is try to paint this just where these are interacting. Now sometimes it's difficult because the spike is in the way. So this is where we can switch to our split view by pressing F1, and I'm gonna go find his knee pad, and I'm gonna paint where that spike is, right here. Now notice that it's actually appearing on the spike itself. I only wanted to affect the knee pad. So here's another quick little Substance Painter tip. If you go to your brush settings, where it says alignment, by default it's set to tangent wrap mode, and that means it's gonna paint across any model that gets underneath your brush. Whether you're painting in 2D view or a 3D view, if I do a brush stroke here, you can see it affects the spike because it's like we're painting in the 3D window. So if I wanna paint the knee pad, but not the spike, I can switch the alignment mode to UV mode. And now it's only going to paint on this UV map. It's not going to affect the spike unless I go find the spike UV and paint it. Now sometimes it's kind of trial and error to make sure you get it right, but if I click right where I think it is, and we get a little bit of a highlight in the metal around the edge of the spike as if it's been hammered in. Now we can go around the model and do this for all the spikes. You can see sometimes I miss, but you just undo and try again until you land on it. And then I will go around the model and do that anywhere that it makes sense. So for example, on this part, I feel like these little spiky rivets where the hinge is attached to the metal, those might have little dips around them because the brass is kind of a softer metal and it's being hammered in. But I don't think this brass is going to push in and deform the steel underneath. So I'll probably add little dips in the brass, but not in the steel underneath. So just wherever this makes sense. It also looks great where the rivets press into leather straps like on these wizard characters up on ProductionCrate. This technique is a great way to show how things are constructed and make them look like they actually fit together. and they're not just pieces of geometry floating next to each other. Okay, and here's actually a bonus tip. And this is actually inspired by the comment section from our previous video. So if you guys want to see anything else in Substance Painter, be sure to leave a comment on this video because we do look at them. So the commenter asked how to get rid of texture seams. So for this example, I'm going to use one of our magic wands from the store. And texture seams are caused by repeating patterns running up to the edge of a UV shell. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to just apply a really quick metal material, kind of a cloudy, scratchy metal material. And if we zoom in really close here, we can see that some of the grunge has a visible seam that runs down the length of the handle. So the most common way to fix this problem is just by switching your projection method from UV to triplanar. And that's right here under projection, UV projection, I'll switch this to triplanar. And now we don't have any texture seams. So what happened is instead of projecting that sort of grungy texture onto this UV map in a 2D way, out here we actually have 3 grunge textures being projected from 3 different directions. And they're being blended together with a soft transition. You can actually see the effect if you grab this gizmo and move it around. So we can actually control this. If we go to the hardness slider, we can increase the hardness and we get our visual texture seam back. I don't know if you can see that. If we decrease the hardness, it's going to blur together. Now there are some limitations to the triplanar projection method. It really only works with sort of soft organic textures. It doesn't really work with hard, visually repeating patterns like a checkerboard or camo. Let me show you that. So if I apply this camo texture, you can see we get that expected visible UV seam right here on the handle. But if I switch it to triplanar projection, because the pattern is so stark, we actually see repeating patterns everywhere, and it's really hard to get rid of these. Even if I adjust the hardness, you can see because it's such a high contrast texture, this triplanar projection is not really a good option for it. So in the case of something like this, you really do have to UV map in an intelligent way to try to hide the seams. I find that switching to triplanar projection does fix most of my texture seam issues, but there are other instances where a different technique needs to be used. Let me show you that. So another thing that can cause visual texture seams is certain filters. Let me show you what I mean by that. I've set up a very simple example. I've got 2 materials on the wand. I've got a red material with a blue material on top, and then a mask, which is cutting off the blue material at about halfway. Now let's say I want to blur this mask. If I add a blur filter and really crank it up, you might start to see some issues like down here. We can see a really obvious texture seam. What's happening is the white section of the wand is being blurred until it bleeds over into the shells next to it. So if you're seeing very obvious weird seams on your model and switching to triplanar projection isn't fixing the problem, go through your effects and see if any of them are causing the issue and either try to find a different way to do the effect, or you may just have to manually paint away things like this to fix it. And let me show you the third most common thing that creates visible texture seams in my projects. There are some materials that just have some special effects associated with them that don't really interact well with UV borders. They create visible seams. And one of those is this bronze armor material. So I've applied the bronze armor material to the handle of the wand, and I can see a very obvious texture seam right here. Now, if you remember from that first substance video we made, I always recommend working from bottom to top to solve your issues, and you'll be able to find what's causing this texture seam. So everything is turned off except this very bottom thing called fill. And this is obviously creating these scratchy textures. So I'm going to switch it to triplanar projection, and that actually solves our issue. There's no texture seam there anymore. So when I turn on Finish Rough, the texture seam comes back. So you might think that you can click on Finish Rough and then switch it to triplanar projection, but you'll see that there's no option for it. I'm going to turn off the fill layer so we're just looking at Finish Rough. And what this effect does is it actually subtly changes the normals of the metal to give it sort of a wrinkly look. Like it's slightly dented or uneven. But unfortunately, the Finish Rough doesn't have a triplanar option. It doesn't work in that mode. And unfortunately, a lot of the pre-made metals that come with Substance Painter have Finish Rough in it, and there's just no way to fix it. So a couple options are, if you can, you want to go back and try to hide your seams a little better in the UV map phase. But if you can't go back to UV mapping, sometimes I just turn off the Finish Rough effect if I don't have time to go back and fix UVs. But just keep that in mind that some effects, they just don't play well with UV borders. So you want to be really conscious of that when you're UV mapping in the first place. So those are the 3 most common causes of visible texture seams that I come across. If you know of any other ones that come up a lot and how to fix them, be sure to leave a comment. Okay, so that was just a few ideas that I like to go through whenever I'm working on a project to sort of push it over the finish line. If you have any other tips like this for us, leave them in the comments and maybe we'll make a video about it. If you make anything cool with this free robot character, be sure to tag us on Instagram with it or post it on our Discord. Alright, later creators.